Okay, so we're recording now, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the
Excuse
webinar
me.
sponsored by Menschwork.org. And we've been having webinars, and if everyone could mute, I appreciate that. Sounds good now, but there'll be some other coming in, so we could all
Mute.
mute. So our webinars happen every second month. And, as they were coming along, we sort of like, what are we else are we going to talk about? But it seems like this last year, we really have done a pretty good job. We started last November, and we featured something that's unique to our group is Mishpacha groups, and Mark Jacobs led a real nice webinar on that. And then in January, we had one of our younger members, Lev Natan, talk about Jewish men and white privilege. In March, Michael Landau hit another big topic that's important for our group is tzedakah and righteous giving, and he facilitated a really good conversation. In May, we dealt with prayer, why, how, and when, led by the JMR 29 Tefillah group. Tonight, we're going to be answering the question. Within an hour, we'll have an answer for you all about how you can be a mensch in the moment. And then in September, we have another person who's been key in the development of Menschwork is Rabbi Mordechai Liebling's going to facilitate a discussion on Jewish social justice. And as I said, I'm recording this because I think that, some of our comments, really should be available because I do know most of you guys I do all of you guys on this phone right now. And I just know there's a lot of wisdom here, and we learn from each other, and we want to move that along. So, the JMR has had the weekend retreats for 28 years, coming up to our 29th year. And at the end of that retreat, men leave and they feel, hopefully empowered. And it's part of our mission to empower men to go on and move up to their next step in their journeys as Jewish men and as mensches. Now, we define mensches in our mission statement as, men of spirit, integrity, responsibility, and purpose in their families, communities, and the larger world. So men leave, but then what happens? Do they, all of a sudden just hit those aspirations, really well? Well, we know the answer is that we have hit and misses. And how do we, seem to adjust ourselves? Well, there's different mechanisms, and I like to talk about the in-moment kind of mechanisms we might have. But in the Jewish tradition, of course, we have our Yom Kippur, and Elul's coming up August 21st, and so we can do a little cheshbon nefesh, a little accounting of the soul, and then of course, I don't think there's anyone who says, "Hey, yeah, I hit all my marks from last year." So that's the challenge, being able to be a mensch in the moment. Now, I'm fortunate that I met Jeff Garson, who through Menschwork retreat JMR, and Jeff has been writing essays, he calls them reflections, for more than a decade. And those reflections have now piled up to the point that he has a book that's going to be published in the fall. And when he and I sort of talked about this, I used some Musar terms, and I want to really honor Herb Levine, who's an excellent Musar teacher. And he just ran a session earlier tonight that was just great. And I feel like I'm scratching the surface, and Herb has got a decade. I think he has some answers. So I threw out the thing about choice points. Our Yetzer, something pulling us that's selfish, and something is in thinking of the other. And this choice point is something that Musar really teaches you how to deal with well. And then when I use these terms, and Jeff, would describe, well, that sounds like, and he used other terms, and he calls them configurations. Terminology sometimes is more inviting to one group or another, and I think they each have their different strengths. So I'm looking forward to a discussion tonight on people sharing what their conflicts are at a moment and what wisdoms they want to share. And I sort of said 3 minutes, so we'll see how we do with the different people who come on. Well, let me introduce my friend Jeff, who, as I said, from the Menschwork we've met, and I'm going to let him talk about some of the things that he's been doing. Have to unmute, Jeff.
Good point. So let me repeat myself. Thank you, Elliot. The idea of being a mensch in a moment is so wrapped up with what I call radical decency, which is, it turns out, my life's work. I've been working on this now for about 15 years. And so I thought I'd give a little bit of background, which is that, like probably a lot of people on this phone call, a subtext of my life from adulthood forward has been, things are broken and I'd like to fix them. Which seems very glib, and it turns out it's very complicated. I think we all know that because I don't see any really young faces on the phone call. So I think radical decency, which emerged for me about 20 years ago after 30 years out there doing all kinds of political projects and service projects and so on. The impression, the feeling I got was so much of what I did were puffs of smoke. I worked on police brutality in Rizzo's Philadelphia in the late 70s. And we did good stuff. But you can see that we did not solve the problem of police brutality in Philadelphia with the things that we passed in city council in 1981, and that theme kept coming back to me. Why is it that discrete projects will emanate good and then shrink back? And what finally came to me was that at bottom, whether we're talking about personal growth or social justice, there's one thing that, there's one unifying theme, which is that we live actually in a world that is highly valued. And the values are not bad, but they're way overemphasized. And I summarize those values as compete and win, dominate and control. And they have their place, but they suffuse everything, and they're pursued without restraint. And I think that when you look underneath all kinds of what I call indecent behaviors, you'll see those values at work. So I'm a lawyer turned psychotherapist. And when I think of some of the social justice issues that I dealt with, like police brutality, it's a move to dominate, right? I mean, by the same token, I do a lot of couples work. When couples fight, and it's the, point counterpoint and this, I'm just loading up to fire back at you. Same thing, these values of domination and control are at work. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so I started thinking, well, what are the values that would lead to being better to the people that surround us, people we work with, and our social justice and political activities in our communities, and very importantly to ourselves. And after some considerable period of time of writing, I came up with 7 values: respect, understanding, empathy, acceptance, appreciation, fairness, and justice. Now that's just my formulation. There are other formulations, and so I find it works well for me. I think there is some value to it, but you get the theme that I'm aiming for. And then the second thing that really informs my thinking and my writing is, because we live in this world that emphasizes this problematic set of values to such an extreme degree, and because we're creatures of habit, which I know richly from my work as a psychotherapist, and we're so influenced by the environments we live in, we not only have to practice these values, but we have to practice them what I call radically, at all times in every context and without exception. If we don't, then these small islands of decency that we try to carve out with our particular projects or with our family and friends, they just too easily get infiltrated by the values that we're practicing every place else. So that's the radical part of the philosophy. it's also where you get back to being a mensch in the moment, because if you think about it, that is an in the moment kind of practice. And it's been one of the great things for me in doing this work, is that more and more I'm getting how in the moment it is, how, you know, an hour doesn't go by when I'm not challenged to think about these values and try to live up to them. Um, the other thing I guess I want to say is I think it's very hard, because decency is to others, but it also has to be to ourselves. You know, we can't privilege ourselves over others, but we shouldn't debase ourselves. I don't believe in, you know, always giving, never asking back. I don't think it's a sustainable philosophy. So when you're operating in infertile soil because of the predominant values, and you're trying to balance decency to self, others, and the world, it gets you into, well, it does a very good thing. It deepens your thinking. I think it challenges you to think as subtly and as expansively as you can about each moment that you're faced with. And I guess the final thing I want to say about the overall approach is, I can't prove this, but I don't think there's anybody who's radically decent. I think it's just, it's aspirational. It's, I mean, I guess there are saints in the world, but you know, I haven't run across any, and God knows I'm not one. So I always say, you know, the touchstone of this approach to a values-based approach, or probably any other approach, is to do it with focus, persistence, and guts. And recently I've been adding more and more in self-compassion, because, you know, over and over again, we're going to be faced with choices that, you know, there's no obvious way to do it. And there, it seems like compromise is involved. Or I'm just too tired to do it. I can't do it. I just have to just go to bed and not make that phone call. You know, and on and on and on. But to me, that's a positive. So the piece that I excerpted for Elliot to circulate is about what I call wisdom stretching. And it's the notion that if you try to live up to this kind of values-based formulation, over and over again, you're put into what I call wisdom stretching moments, which leads to my notion that wisdom is not a noun, it's a verb, it's a muscle. That if you keep trying to exercise wisdom, you're going to get better at it. And that's good. That's a great thing. So that's a kind of précis of the philosophy. I also want to mention its tie-in with Judaism. I am a Jew by choice. And getting right back to your theme, Elliot, I was raised in a Protestant church, and my father was Jewish, the most secular Jew in the history of the world. But, you know, when my mother took me to that church and they said, love your fellow man, I remember leaving at 11 and thinking, well, they didn't tell me anything about what I should do between now and next Sunday at 10 when we come back here. And when I figured out, this was at 15, but when I figured out in my early 20s that I was Jewish, one of the things I remember thinking was, by God, they take a stand, you know? There's a prayer for everything, you know? There's a prayer for going to the bathroom. And I don't know if I agree with it, but they take a stand. They really seem to really get that you really have to dig in and look at everything if you're going to come up with something. The other thing I want to say is, do any of you remember the Shefa Fund from the late 90s? Well, I worked there for 2 years. And Jeffrey Dacro, who was a very provocative thinker and the head of the Shefa Fund, because this was brewing for me back then, said, you know, Jeff, you know, your ideas have been around for, you know, a couple of years. Judaism's been around for 2,500 years. And, you know, you want to really give that some thought.